The morning light slid gently across the hills of Ajaccio, painting the stones in shades of gold and rose. The air was cool and carried the faint salt of the nearby sea. In the distance, the water moved like slow glass, catching the sun in brief flashes. On the narrow streets, shutters opened one by one, letting in the day. In a small house overlooking the harbor, a boy stirred awake. His bed was plain, the sheets a little rough against his skin, yet there was comfort in their warmth. He rose quietly, careful not to wake his siblings, and stepped toward the small window that faced the eastern shore. Outside, the hills rolled upward into wild green, their slopes scattered with olive trees and low stone walls. The house smelled faintly of bread and ash from the fire that had burned through the night. Somewhere below, his mother's footsteps moved across the wooden floor. He could hear the sound of water being poured into a basin, the quiet rhythm of a home beginning its day. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. The boy dressed quickly, fastening his plain shirt and pulling on his boots. His mind was already far from the room. He thought of the ships in the harbor, their tall masts swaying against the blue sky, and the way the sailors called to one another in voices roughened by salt and wind. He thought of the small square in the town, where men gathered to speak of politics and war, and how their words carried an energy that stirred something restless in him. Stepping outside, the world felt wide and clear. The sun had risen higher, and the cobblestones glowed with its touch. He walked toward the edge of the harbor, the gulls sweeping low and calling over the water. The smell of the sea filled his lungs, sharp and alive. He paused by a low wall that separated the street from the shore. From here, he could see beyond the port to the open horizon. Somewhere out there was France, the heart of a country already shifting with new ideas, a place he barely knew but would one day shape with his own hands. For now, he was only a boy of Corsica, the son of a modest but ambitious family, and his future was a shape still hidden in the mist. The day moved on, slow and bright. He returned to the house for a meal of bread and olives, listening as his father spoke in measured tones about the affairs of the island. Words like governor, rebellion, and opportunity drifted to his ears, half understood but impossible to ignore. The boy kept his head low, though every syllable lodged somewhere deep in his thoughts. In the afternoon, he walked beyond the edge of the town, climbing the low hills where the wind carried the smell of pine and earth. From the crest, he looked down upon Ajaccio, its white walls and terracotta roofs huddled along the curve of the bay. The ships were still there, rocking gently in their moorings, and beyond them, the endless reach of the sea. The boy felt the pull of both land and water, the solid ground of his island home and the vast, unknown spaces beyond. He did not yet know how far that pull would take him, or how much of the world he would one day claim. But something in him stirred, something that no quiet hillside or calm harbor could keep still. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the voices of the streets softened into evening tones. He made his way home, the air growing cooler with each step. Inside, the lamps were lit, and the smell of soup drifted through the rooms. Night gathered over Ajaccio, settling gently like a blanket. In his small bed, the boy lay awake for a while, listening to the waves beyond the harbor wall. The sound was steady, endless, like a promise whispered in the dark. One day it seemed to say, "You will go far from here. One day your name will travel farther still." The year turned, and the hills of Corsica shifted through their seasons. The olive groves thickened with green, the winds carried the heat of summer, and then the rains came to wash the dust from the stones. In the small house overlooking the harbor, life moved with the steady rhythm of the island. But for the boy, the days began to carry a sharper edge, as if the air itself was urging him forward. It was decided that he would leave for France to study. The thought stirred a mix of excitement and unease. France was not his island. Its language, its manners, even its very air would be different. But there was no question in his mind. This was the path laid before him. On the morning of his departure, the harbor was alive with movement. Merchants called out their prices. Fishermen hauled nets heavy with the silver glint of the sea's catch, and sailors shouted to one another across the decks. The boy stood with his small bundle of belongings, the wooden boards of the pier warm under the rising sun. His family gathered near, their faces set with quiet pride and a hint of worry. The ship was a modest vessel, its sails already straining in the wind. When the time came to board, the boy turned once to look at the curve of Ajacio's bay, the clustered roofs, and the hills rising behind them. He tried to fix the sight in his memory, not knowing how long it would be before he saw it again. The journey across the water was long and uneven. The sea shifted from calm glass to restless swells, and the wind moved in fits and sighs. He spent hours at the rail, watching the horizon stretch out like a road with no end. At night, the stars hung close, the ship's timbers creaking under their weight. When at last the coast of France came into view, it rose from the water like a distant promise turning real. The port was larger than any he had known, filled with ships of many shapes and sizes, their sails snapping in the wind. The streets beyond were crowded, the air thick with the mingled scents of bread, smoke, and horse. From there, he traveled inland to the military school where he would begin his training. The buildings were of cold stone, their high windows letting in pale winter light. The air carried the faint bite of snow, and his breath came in clouds. Life at the school was strict and ordered. The days began early, the sound of the bell breaking the stillness before dawn. There were drills in the yard, the stamp of boots on frozen ground, and long hours bent over maps and books in drafty rooms. The boy learned to move with precision, to think with clarity, to see patterns in the chaos of battle. He was quiet among his classmates, his accent marking him as an outsider. Some mocked him for it, but he let their words pass without answer. In the silence, he studied harder, walked longer under the cold stars, and kept his thoughts fixed on the future he meant to claim. Winter gave way to spring, and the training grew more demanding. His mind began to work in the sharp lines of strategy, the measured pace of tactics. He could read the sweep of a battlefield as one might read the lines of a map, seeing not just what was but what could be. At night, in the small dormitory room, he would lie awake and think of the sea, of Corsica's hills, and of the ships rocking gently in Ajacio's harbor. Those memories were like stones in his pocket, small, solid, and always there to remind him of where he had come from. But they no longer held him. Something larger now pulled at him, something that reached far beyond the curve of his island's bay. The years at the academy passed with a slow but steady weight. What had begun as the awkward steps of a boy far from home became the sure-footed march of a young officer. The uniform no longer felt like a borrowed skin. It fit now not just in cloth but in the shape of his mind. When he received his commission, the paper felt lighter than the meaning it carried. It was a key, and beyond the door it opened lay a country in upheaval. France was no longer the realm of a king. The old order had been shattered, and the streets trembled with new voices. The revolution had swept across the land like a fire, burning away the gilded layers and leaving behind something raw, uncertain, and full of dangerous promise. His first post took him south, to a garrison where the air smelled of gunpowder and damp stone. The town was restless, its people caught between fear and fervor. Soldiers moved through the streets in worn boots, their coats heavy with dust. Orders came quickly and often, each carrying the weight of a nation struggling to hold itself together. The young officer studied every detail. He learned to see not only the movements of men, but the shape of the terrain, the strength of fortifications, the pulse of a crowd. In the quiet hours before dawn, he would walk the walls of the fortress, feeling the cold stone under his hands, and imagine how an enemy might take it, or how he himself might defend it. War was no longer a distant idea on the pages of a book. It was here, carried in the smoke that rose beyond the hills, in the hurried steps of messengers, in the sudden silence when news of a battle reached the camp. He began to see how courage could falter, how discipline could hold it firm, and how the smallest decision at the right moment could turn the tide. It was in these early campaigns that his sharpness began to draw notice. Superiors saw the precision in his orders, the speed of his movements. He had a way of reading the chaos, of finding the one thread that could be pulled to unravel the enemy's hold. One autumn evening, the air heavy with the scent of rain, he stood on a ridge overlooking a valley where the enemy lay camped. The sun had sunk behind the hills, leaving the land painted in deep shades of blue and gray. He studied the ground, the placement of tents, the way the river curved through the fields. His mind began to move faster than the clouds overhead. By morning, he had a plan. The strike came swift and hard. The enemy was caught unready, their lines broken before the day had fully risen. It was not just victory. It was a victory born of calculation, of watching, of knowing the land better than those who fought upon it. Word of his success moved quickly, passed from one officer to another. His name began to carry weight, not yet as a legend, but as a man to be watched. The revolution needed men who could win, and he had shown he was one of them. In the months that followed, he was given greater commands. His maps grew larger, the stakes higher. The young officer from Corsica was no longer just learning the art of war. He was shaping it, bending it to his will. The sound of drums, the smell of powder, the thunder of cannon, all became part of the rhythm of his days. But even in victory, he did not lose the quiet habit of observation. He still walked the ground before battle, still traced the lines of hills and rivers with his eyes, still thought like a boy standing on the harbor wall of Ajaccio, measuring the distance to a far horizon. The air in Paris was restless, thick with the weight of both triumph and uncertainty. Victories had been won, yet the revolution's fire still flickered in unpredictable gusts. In the salons and council halls, men argued over the future of France, their voices quick and sharp like drawn blades. And in the middle of it all stood the young general from Corsica, his name now carried on the wind of every campaign. It was here that the whispers began, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves before a storm. Egypt, a land of endless sands and ancient stones, of mysteries older than the pyramids themselves. The plan was bold, almost impossible. Strike at British influence by seizing a land that touched both history and empire. When the orders came, they carried more than a mission. They carried the weight of destiny. The general prepared without hesitation, gathering ships, soldiers, and scholars. This would not only be a conquest of arms, but of knowledge. The East was not just to be fought. It was to be studied, understood, and perhaps, in some way, possessed. The fleet sailed from the Mediterranean coast, the air heavy with the scent of salt and tar. The days at sea were bright and blinding, the nights deep and star-filled. He stood often at the prow, the wind pressing against his coat, his gaze fixed ahead as if he could already see the shifting dunes waiting beyond the horizon. When at last the coast of Egypt rose from the water, it came not as a gentle vision but as a sudden blaze of heat and light. The land shimmered under the sun, a vast expanse of gold and ochre stretching beyond sight. Palms swayed in the hot wind, and the air carried a dry, almost metallic taste. The march inland was like moving through another world. The sand swallowed footsteps, the sky hung wide and merciless, and the air seemed to hum with the weight of ancient centuries. Villages appeared like mirages, their walls of mud brick blending into the land itself. Minarets rose above the flat roofs, their slender shapes cutting into the blue. Then came the battle, the clash at the pyramids. The enemy moved swiftly across the plain, their banners snapping in the wind. The general stood upon a slight rise, the great stones of Giza looming in the distance like silent witnesses to the moment. He read the field as he had done so many times before, but here, the ground seemed to speak in an older tongue, its lines and shadows holding both danger and possibility. The order went out, precise and sharp. French squares formed like clockwork, bayonets bristling in the sun. The enemy charges broke against them, wave after wave shattering in the heat. All the while, the pyramids stood unmoving, their ancient faces turned toward a battle that was nothing more than another grain of sand in their long memory. Victory was swift and complete. The land was theirs for now. Yet even in triumph, the general felt the pull of something deeper. At night, he walked among the ruins with the scholars, tracing the worn carvings on stone, feeling the cool breath of tombs that had not been opened for thousands of years. The desert whispered to him not of power, but of the scale of time, of the smallness of human ambition when measured against eternity. But Egypt was not a prize that could be easily held. The British shadow moved over the sea, their ships prowling the coast. Supply lines strained, unrest grew, and the heat pressed down like an unyielding hand. Still, for the general, Egypt was more than a campaign. It was a vision, a reminder that his reach could extend beyond Europe, that his name could stand beside those carved into the walls of forgotten temples. The return from Egypt was not a march of victory through golden streets. It was quieter, shadowed by the losses and the knowledge that the campaign had been both a triumph of will and a strain on the nation's strength. Yet when the general set foot again on French soil, the air around him seemed to hum with expectation. France was tired. The revolution's blaze had burned bright, but its heat had cracked the walls of government. Councils bickered, factions shifted, and the streets of Paris still held the echoes of unrest. The people wanted stability, and the leaders wanted someone who could hold the fragile structure together without letting it fall into the chaos that still lingered just beyond the edges of order. In this climate, his return was more than welcome. It was an opening. The corridors of power whispered his name, not as a soldier alone, but as a man who might rule. He moved through these halls as one moves through the preparations before a storm, each step calculated, each glance weighed. His presence was quiet but heavy, like the air before rain. Then came the moment, the coup of 18 Brumaire. The day was cold, the sky a low gray, and Paris seemed to wait as troops moved into position. Inside the chambers of government, voices rose in anger, papers scattered, and chairs scraped harshly against stone floors. But the general's movements were measured, his voice steady, his control absolute. He stepped through the confusion not as a man seizing power in desperation, but as one accepting what had already been set aside for him by the shape of events. When the dust settled, the old order was gone. In its place stood the consulate, and at its head, the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. The title was more than a name. It was a mantle of authority, a weight that settled on his shoulders without bending them. He had passed from the role of servant to the republic to its architect and guardian. Paris changed in those days. The streets still bustled, the markets still called out their prices, but there was a sense of direction now, a tightening of the loose threads. Laws were rewritten, roads improved, schools established. It was as if the city had been a tangled skein of rope, and the first consul's hands had begun to pull it into order. Yet behind the quiet hum of reform, the pulse of ambition beat steadily. His gaze was never fixed only on the present. The map of Europe was always in his mind, each border a line to be guarded, shifted, or claimed. He knew that the peace he was weaving at home was only a pause between campaigns. France could not remain still, and neither could he. In the evenings, he would work long after the lamps were lit, the scratch of the pen filling the silence of the room. The walls were lined with maps, the tables with papers. A visitor might see a leader deep in the details of governance, but in truth, he was also charting the future, the paths of armies yet to march, the alliances yet to be made or broken. The city slept under his watch, but the man himself was never still. Even in moments of apparent rest, his mind moved ahead, step by step, toward a horizon that no one else could quite see. Paris awoke to the sound of hammers and the scent of fresh-cut stone. Across the city, scaffolds rose, bridges took shape, and wide roads cut through neighborhoods where the streets had once been narrow and twisting. The first consul's vision was no longer just on paper, it was spreading through the very bones of France. But the changes in stone and marble were only the outer signs of a greater transformation. Paris changed in those days. The streets still bustled, the markets still called out their prices, but there was a sense of direction now, a tightening of the loose threads. Laws were rewritten, roads improved, schools established. It was as if the city had been a tangled skein of rope, and the first consul's hands had begun to pull it into order. Yet behind the quiet hum of reform, the pulse of ambition beat steadily. His gaze was never fixed only on the present. The map of Europe was always in his mind, each border a line to be guarded, shifted, or claimed. He knew that the peace he was weaving at home was only a pause between campaigns. France could not remain still, and neither could he. In the evenings, he would work long after the lamps were lit, the scratch of the pen filling the silence of the room. The walls were lined with maps, the tables with papers. A visitor might see a leader deep in the details of governance, but in truth, he was also charting the future, the paths of armies yet to march, the alliances yet to be made or broken. The city slept under his watch, but the man himself was never still. Even in moments of apparent rest, his mind moved ahead, step by step, toward a horizon that no one else could quite see. Paris awoke to the sound of hammers and the scent of fresh-cut stone. Across the city, scaffolds rose, bridges took shape, and wide roads cut through neighborhoods where the streets had once been narrow and twisting. The first consul's vision was no longer just on paper, it was spreading through the very bones of France. But the changes in stone and marble were only the outer signs of a greater transformation. Yet even in this moment of triumph, there was an edge of steel beneath the gold. The armies were already gathering, their banners ready to move across the fields of Europe. Diplomats wrote polite words that masked the sharpening of alliances and rivalries. Napoleon knew that an empire was not simply built, it was defended, expanded, and, if necessary, taken by force. Paris glittered in the winter light, its avenues swept clean, its monuments standing tall. But beneath the marble and the ceremony lay the quiet hum of preparation. The empire had been crowned, but the work of holding it had only just begun. The winter after the coronation did not rest quietly over France. Maps were spread on tables in Paris and lines were drawn not in ink alone, but in the iron and blood of what would follow. The empire had been declared. Now it would prove itself on the fields of Europe. The armies began to move their columns stretching for miles across frozen roads. Drums beat a steady rhythm, boots struck the earth in unison, and the cold air carried the metallic scent of muskets and steel. Villages watched in silence as the tide of men passed by, banners snapping in the wind like the heralds of a coming storm. The campaign of Ulm came swiftly. The enemy was surrounded before they could fully grasp the trap closing around them. It was not brute force that won the day, but speed, marches calculated to the hour, movements hidden by the terrain, and a sudden tightening of the noose that left no way out. Entire armies laid down their arms without a battle, and the roads were lined with the stacked muskets of surrender. But it was at Austerlitz that the Empire's thunder truly rolled. The morning was cold, a pale mist rising from the frozen ponds. The enemy believed they had the advantage. Their lines stretched across the high ground. Napoleon's troops held the low valleys, the positions seeming weaker than they were. The plan was already in motion, hidden beneath the quiet patience of the Army. When the sun broke through the mist, its light spilled over the field in what would later be called the Sun of Austerlitz. At that signal, the French center surged forward, the enemy drawn down from their heights into the waiting trap. Flanks collapsed, formations splintered, and the ponds, thinly iced, became graveyards for men and horses as the ice shattered beneath the chaos. Victory was complete, so decisive that it seemed to rewrite the map before the ink of treaties could even dry. Across Europe, rulers looked to their borders with new caution. Allies bowed closer to France, while enemies planned more carefully, knowing the storm they faced. Campaign followed campaign, across the fields of Prussia, through the cities of Poland, along the wide rivers and narrow passes of Central Europe. Each battle carried its own weight, but the pattern was the same. Speed, precision, and an unshakable confidence in the march forward. Paris celebrated each return with parades and cheers, but Napoleon's eyes were already on the next campaign. The empire was like a fire, brilliant and warm when fed, but in constant danger of fading if left untended. He fed it with victories, with the movement of armies, with the tightening grip of French influence on the continent. Yet, with each mile gained, the roads home grew longer, and the strain upon the empire's reach grew heavier. The thunder rolled on, but far ahead, on the edges of the map, darker clouds began to gather. The roads east seemed endless, cutting through fields and forests that swallowed the horizon. The summer of the Russian campaign began with the same certainty that had carried the empire through so many victories. Maps were marked, supply trains stretched behind the marching columns, and the air was thick with the belief that speed and force would once again deliver triumph. But Russia was not like the other lands Napoleon had taken. The enemy did not stand to fight in the open. Villages were emptied before the French could reach them. Their granaries burned, their wells fouled. Fields that might have fed an army were left as ash under the wide sky. The land itself became a weapon, slow and merciless. The army pressed on, the days warm, the nights cool with the edge of approaching autumn. Skirmishes flared and faded, but no great battle came to anchor the campaign. The march grew longer, and the lines of supply thinner, stretching like thread that could snap with a single sharp pull. When at last the enemy turned to stand at Borodino, the earth shook with the weight of cannon. Smoke thickened until the air itself seemed made of ash. The ground was torn by shot and shell, and men fell in the thousands, their blood soaking into the soil they had fought to claim. By nightfall, the French held the field, but victory came like a hollow echo, hard-won, costly, and without the final blow that could end the war. Moscow lay ahead, its domes rising in the distance. Yet when the army entered, it was not the jewel of a captured prize. It was a city set aflame. The fires roared through the streets, devouring wood and stone alike, their light painting the night in furious gold and black. There was no shelter here, no stores of food, no peace to claim. Only ruin and the growing chill of the approaching winter. The retreat began as a march, but soon it became a struggle for survival. Snow fell in steady, endless sheets, covering the land in white silence. The cold crept into every joint, every seam of clothing, turning breath into frost and fingers into stone. Horses fell in the snow, their bodies stiff in moments. Men staggered, their eyes glassy, their movements slowed until they simply sank down and did not rise again. The roads back were marked not by milestones, but by the still forms left behind. The Empire's thunder had met a silence more powerful than any cannon. The Russian winter was not a battle. It was a slow, unrelenting grip that tightened until even the strongest could not pull free. By the time the survivors crossed back into friendlier lands, the great army that had marched east was a shadow of itself. Napoleon's cloak still wrapped tight against the cold, his step still firm, but in his eyes lay the knowledge that this was no ordinary setback. Something in the balance of the empire had shifted. The retreat from Russia had left more than frozen footprints behind. It had left cracks in the empire's foundation. One by one, allies who had once marched at Napoleon's side began to drift away. Some broke openly, taking up arms against him. Others simply stood aside, letting the tide turn without resistance. The campaigns that followed were fought hard and fast, but the weight of the past winter clung to every march. Victories came, but they were smaller now, their gains fleeting. Losses gathered like shadows, stretching longer with each season. And then, in the spring, the coalition closed in. From the north, south, and east, enemy armies converged like the jaws of a great trap. Paris could no longer be held. The city fell not in a single violent blow, but in a slow surrender to inevitability. The streets were quiet, the air heavy, as Napoleon stepped away from the throne he had built. The crown, once lifted by his own hands, was set aside. Elba awaited, a small island in the Mediterranean, far from the grand halls of Paris and the sweeping fields of Europe. The journey there was a strange one, the sea stretching in calm waves beneath a sky too blue for the weight he carried. The island appeared on the horizon as a green shape rising from the water, its hills soft and low, its harbors peaceful. Life on Elba was a life reduced. The emperor became a ruler of a fragment, overseeing roads and gardens, inspecting the small fleet in the harbor, speaking with the islanders in the sunlit squares. He walked the narrow paths between olive groves, the scent of the sea always near. Yet the rhythm was too quiet, the scale too small for the mind that had once commanded continents. At night, from the terrace of his modest residence, he would look out over the dark water. Lights from passing ships would flicker far off, moving toward coasts he could no longer touch. The sound of waves was steady, but beneath it he could almost hear the faint echo of drums and cannon from another life. The world beyond Elba was still in motion. France was in the hands of others now, and the same forces that had once raised him were shifting again. News came across the water. Dissatisfaction, unrest, whispers that the Bourbon king could not hold the loyalty of the people. Each rumor was like a spark on dry grass. Napoleon walked the island's paths, spoke calmly to those around him, and kept his plans silent. But in his eyes there was a light that no quiet exile could extinguish. The horizon was not a wall, it was a road, and roads, he knew, could always be crossed. The winter on Elba passed quietly, but the quiet was only surface deep. Beneath the calm routines, the island held a secret pulse, one that matched the beat of Napoleon's own thoughts. Ships came and went under the cover of trade, bringing more than goods. They brought news, letters, and the unspoken question of whether the emperor was truly finished. The answer formed not in words, but in action. One night, the harbor lay still under a pale moon, the water dark and glassy. Small crews moved in silence, preparing a modest flotilla. Napoleon stepped aboard with the ease of a man walking onto familiar ground. No grand declaration was made, no trumpet sounded. The sails caught the wind, and the island faded into the distance. Days later, the coast of France rose from the water. The landing was quiet, far from the watchful eyes of enemy garrisons. From there, the march began, not toward Paris in a blaze of war, but as a gathering tide. Villagers came out to see the man they had heard was gone forever. Some watched in silence. Others stepped forward, their voices low at first, then growing louder. Soldiers sent to stop him found themselves drawn into his ranks. Their orders dissolved under the pull of memory and loyalty. The road north became a living thing, swelling with each mile. Winter gave way to early spring, the air still sharp but carrying the faint scent of new growth. Napoleon rode at the head, his coat plain, his gaze fixed ahead. Each town that welcomed him became another stone in the path leading back to power. When Paris came into view, it was not the Paris he had left. The Bourbon king had fled, the city's gates open. The emperor entered without battle, without siege. His return marked not by the clash of cannon but by the sound of boots on familiar streets. But the 100 days were not to be a season of peace. The coalition moved quickly, gathering armies across Europe. Napoleon worked without pause, rebuilding the forces that had once carried him to the edges of empire. Plans were drawn, maps marked, alliances tested. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide not just the fate of France, but his place in history. The days passed in a blur of preparation. Drums echoed in the courtyards, forges burned hot, and the roads filled with marching columns. The final campaign was coming, swift as a storm, and all the weight of the past years pressed toward it. Somewhere beyond the northern horizon, the fields of Belgium waited. And in the space between preparation and battle, Napoleon moved like a man who knew that every step might be his last chance to shape the world. The road into Belgium was damp with the rains of early summer. Low clouds drifted over green fields, their edges dark with the shadow of approaching storms. Napoleon's army moved north, boots sinking slightly into the softened earth, wheels of gun carriages leaving deep grooves that filled slowly with water. The campaign began with speed, the same quick precision that had served him so often before. At Ligny, the Prussians were beaten back, their lines broken under the push of French infantry and the roar of cannon. It was a sharp, hard victory, but not complete. The enemy retreated, still intact enough to fight again. From there, Napoleon turned toward the British forces under Wellington, positioned near a small village called Waterloo. The ground there was rolling farmland, crossed by hedges and narrow roads, with a ridge that gave the enemy a strong defensive line. The rain fell through the night before the battle, soaking the fields until they became heavy with mud. Dawn came gray and cool, the air damp, the grass bent under the weight of water. The French guns opened, their thunder rolling across the hills. Infantry advanced, their uniforms darkened by the rain, muskets held ready. The ground slowed them, every step pulling at their boots, but still they pressed on. Fighting surged back and forth across the fields. Farmhouses became fortresses, their walls shattered by cannon fire but held stubbornly by defenders. Cavalry charged through the mud, the earth churning under the pounding of hooves, only to be met by walls of British bayonets. The battle seemed to sway like a pendulum, first one side gaining ground, then the other. By afternoon, the Prussians had returned, their columns appearing on the French flank. The balance tipped sharply. What had been a contest became a tightening vice. Napoleon's orders came quickly, his eyes scanning the chaos for some last chance to turn the tide. But the field was slipping away, each charge blunted, each defense pushed back. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the trampled ground. The ridge held, the enemy lines stood, and the French began to fall away in retreat. The thunder of cannon faded into the distance, replaced by the low rumble of men and horses withdrawing over the darkening fields. Waterloo was not just a defeat, it was an ending. The road ahead led not to Paris in triumph, but to a closing door. The empire, built in marble and blood, had met the one field it could not claim. The days after Waterloo passed in a haze of retreat and resignation. Paris did not greet Napoleon as it once had. The streets felt colder, the air heavier, the sound of footsteps muted by the knowledge that the empire's sun had set. The decision came quickly, abdication again. But this time, there would be no small island close to the heart of Europe, no horizon within reach of return. The British chose St. Helena, a speck of volcanic rock in the vast South Atlantic, far from any shore, far from any ally, far from the shifting currents of politics. It was a place where the world could forget. The voyage took weeks, the ship cutting through waves that seemed to stretch without end. Nights on deck were filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, but their beauty only deepened the distance from everything he had known. The island rose from the sea as a dark, uneven mass, its cliffs beaten by endless surf. The air was damp, the winds carrying the salt of the ocean and the faint scent of earth turned by rain. Longwood House became his residence, a plain, weather-worn building on a windswept plateau, its walls thin against the island's shifting weather. Life settled into a slow rhythm. Mornings began with walks among gardens, their flowers struggling against the wind. Afternoons were spent dictating memories, shaping the story of his life into words that would travel where he no longer could. The evenings were quiet, the light fading over hills that fell sharply into the restless sea. The guards were always present, their figures distant but constant, like shadows cast by an unseen lamp. Letters came rarely, news even less. The world beyond the island moved on, its battles fought without him, its maps redrawn by other hands. Yet in his mind, campaigns still unfolded, battles still turned at the stroke of an idea. Europe still shifted beneath his command. Illness came slowly, like a fog creeping inland from the coast. The air seemed heavier, his steps slower, the nights longer. Still, he would stand at the edge of the plateau, the wind in his face, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There was nothing beyond it for him now, but the habit of looking never left. On a gray day in early May, the island was quiet. The sea rolled against the cliffs, the wind moved gently through the grasses, and the man who had once carried the weight of an empire lay still. The long night had come, not with the roar of cannon, but with the hush of waves and the steady beat of the ocean against the shore. Far away, in cities and fields he would never see again, his name lived on in stone, in books, in the murmured stories of soldiers and statesmen. And on St. Helena, the wind carried no crown, no banners, no armies, only the memory of what had been, fading into the endless sky.